Amelia Melendez Ackerman from the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras, and it is a pleasure to introduce Peter Raven. And before we start the interview, I would like to say some things about him. For 4 decades, he headed the Missouri Botanical Garden, and as I'm reading this dossier, he has received just about any prize that you can imagine in tropical biology. I think this is probably the best known, if not one of the most known. He is in different Academy of Sciences, not only in the United States, but in different countries. He's been described by Time magazine as the hero for the planet. So I'm just so lucky that I got to interview you and not somebody else. So there you are. Here we are. Where did it all begin?
Well, I made my first visit to the tropics in 1959 when I was a graduate student at UCLA. I was to Colombia. I spent 2 months there with students on an exchange. And that was really before we began worrying too much about the tropics. A few people had begun predicting that the forests would be cut and so forth, but it really wasn't clear. And it was only as the 60s rolled out and we got to a 2.7 rate of increase in population eventually in 1971 that we began to realize that environment was in trouble worldwide and in developing countries especially. My first introduction to OTS was through Tom Emmel, who was a graduate student at Stanford, where I was teaching in the 1960s. And he was organizing a course for 1967. And he suggested that I come for half the course and do botany for half the course. Roy McDermott was doing the zoological part. So I headed out. We had a preliminary trip in 1966, and I was able to see things like Finca La Selva when it was abandoned by Holdridge, really, and before OTS had acquired it. In 67, I came down, and the primary field sites where I worked were Rincon de Osa, which in those days was fully forested, and I collected plants and looked there and taught, and it was a wonderful paradise of an introduction. And I got to meet people like Luis Diego Gomez and so forth, and just had a really great time. Then we went to San Vito de Java, which was still owned by the Wilsons, and that was all forest, all the way down to the river and all the way up on the ridges above. I mean, I remember noting that there were just a couple of small plots where people were growing vegetables along the road up on the ridge. And of course, now the Jardín Botánico Las Cruces Wilson is an island in a totally deforested sea. One of the strange things about Costa Rica was that although it was the best country for preservation in the tropics, it had one of the fastest, and for some years the fastest rate of deforestation of any tropical country. So we watched so many favorite scenes go. As the Meseta Central had gone in the 19th century and early 20th century, so a lot of the rest of the country went. But because of the unique character of Costa Rica, with no army, high attention to education and to medical care for people and to social equality, and a strong affinity to the United States, where so many people went and got university instruction after World War II, it was an ideal place for Avro Galde and others to form the national park system, the protected system. I didn't have much to do with OTS then until I moved to the Missouri Botanical Garden in Washington University in St. Louis in 1971. Washington University was already a member, one of the consortium that were running OTS, and so I became a delegate to OTS and enjoyed a number of trips on the board at that time as it was, and as time went by, eventually La Selva was acquired, And then we realized that the whole area above La Selva would be deforested, which would have been a real blow. It would have left La Selva as an isolated island down in the middle of the Caribbean lowlands. And so Bill Burley, who was then at the Nature Conservancy, and I began to we conceived the idea, the board conceived the idea of acquiring what's now called the Zona Protectora, which was a strip going down from Braulio Carrillo Park down to La Selva. And Bill Burley and I raised $1.7 million to buy that strip. And so that was a great thing, because then the bellbirds could wander up and down. It's interesting that that strip, which is so interesting biologically, has still been very little explored. You could still find many interesting things there, but of course a lot of it is very inaccessible. Obviously in the tropics things are varying step by step as you go all the way up. Well, after that I stayed on the board and was head of development for OTS. Raising that money was great for me because it gave me a great opportunity to visit foundations all over the United States, and in doing that I got to know many people. For example, Bill Robertson, who was later at the A.W. Mellon Foundation, a very important patron of OTS. My visit to him at the Mellon Foundation was his first exposure to OTS, and really got him started on a plant and ecology program that lasted until his retirement, which will take place this year, 2013. And he was able, through the foundation, to put millions of dollars into education and facilities and so forth in the tropics. I, of course, I was a very good friend of Don and Bev Stone. Don was a TA of mine at Berkeley in 1957, and we stayed in good touch all the time, and I was really happy when Don and Duke University began to manage OTS. I do remember the story of when Don came to Costa Rica the first time with the treasurer of Duke University to check on the finances. He called on the manager of finances at the OTS office, at the old OTS office, and they went into the office and they said, "Show us the books." And the finance manager said, "Well, the first thing you have to understand is that in Costa Rica, it's not simply a matter of money coming in and money going out." Which led them to be very
system science.
Led them to be very concerned, because if not that, what was it? Anyway, OTS since then has enjoyed a wonderful relationship with Duke University. The main subject for conversation then was, one of the main subjects for conversation on the board in those years, the 70s and 80s, was OTS was stimulated by a lot of U.S. universities and a lot of Costa Rican universities, and on most of the major Costa Rican universities. But it was always a question, how much were we an American institution and how much we were a Costa Rican institution? And I think it was during those years that we really made the transition to have courses, basic courses in Spanish, and we made a very big effort to make sure we were linked to UCR and UNA and the other Costa Rican institutions more closely than we had been, and that there were plenty of opportunities for them. In those days, we operated on the assumption that OTS would be best operating mostly in Costa Rica because we were grounded here. We acquired permanent facilities for the first time, the 3 permanent stations. And one of my activities as president was to receive the San Vito Botanical Garden from the Wilsons formally in a ceremony in the garden, and I remember that very well. I noticed there's a picture of it running on the web inside. Another of my activities as president was to receive the Tyler Prize for OTS, along with Jay Savage, who of course was a great friend and still is, to receive the Tyler Prize for OTS. It was always favored, it was very much favored by NSF because they understood, the U.S. National Science Foundation, because they understood that a consortium teaching principles of tropical ecology here and then with many special courses would be a great thing. And Don and I were very close friends of Bill Sievers, who was the program officer at NSF in the pertinent field during the 1970s and into the early 80s. And Bill and the programs that he administered made a huge contribution to OTS. And of course, when I first went to La Selva, when it was still owned by Les Holdridge and Tropical Science Center, we used to, in those days, of course, go in a canoe, which we would just go to the bridge in the nearby town and look for somebody who might be able to take us there, and then scramble up the muddy bank to the top. And of course, eventually there was a beautiful bridge there.
Yes.
Beautiful bridge. The Missouri Botanical Garden, the institution that I headed from 1971 to 2010, sent its first expedition to Costa Rica, two graduate students, Hugh Iltis, who became a famous conservationist, and Dick Holm, who went to Stanford and passed away many years ago, in 1949.
Wow.
We were working on the Missouri Botanical Garden was working on a flora of Panama, which it had begun around its transplant station for orchids in the canal zone, and early, and that was going. And they were sent to Costa Rica to look for parallels. And of course, one of the reasons that they came to Costa Rica was the Pan American Highway had just been completed over the Cerro de la Muerte, and it was very interesting, to get into whole new areas. It used to be United Fruit Company south of Cerro de la Muerte and the mountains, and then these things north. But that opened up a whole new zone, which of course was very interesting for exploration. We finished the Flora of Panama in 1981, although I suspect 25% more plant species have been found in Panama since then. We later on, Bill Berger, who was also an alumnus of the Missouri Botanical Garden and a longtime staff member at the Field Museum, had started a Flora costarricense, but it was proceeding very slowly, and I got the idea of starting more of a manual, more rapid production of a manual flora of Costa Rica in, I forget what year I got the idea, but it was I remember it very well that it was while driving in a car and into the parking lot at the old OTS headquarters. It just occurred to me, light bulb. And we had Barry Hamill and Mike Graham on our staff took up that project, and then of course Barry's been living here. Mike started out living here and Barry started living in St. Louis, and they both decided that they were better suited for the opposite role. Barry was a student at Duke, so it all kind of ties together in an incestuous way.
So it seems like your I guess your initial work with OTS and at the Botanical Garden was very taxonomical oriented. When did it
not
shift?
Not with OTS, but in the garden, the work is oriented to taxonomy, inventory, and conservation, pretty much.
Well, but at some point, it seems that conservation was more predominant
In the garden's work?
Yeah.
Well,
or yeah. Or
Well, it became, well, as I was saying, in the 1960s, we just barely had begun to think about conservation. So and in fact, ecology wasn't so big as a science in the 1960s. And so OTS really played a role in making the transition into thinking about tropical ecology overall, particularly after acquiring La Selva. Uh, Now, the Missouri Botanical Garden is one of the biggest taxonomic institutions in the world. We have a herbarium of about 7 million specimens. We have about 50 staff members studying taxonomy, and we have, associated people all over the world. So it's, and one of the best libraries in the world. So it's natural for us to keep on with an inventory vein. But one of the things that we did at the garden, it just came naturally, was to begin to have staff members actually live in the countries where they were working. I later, in the 70s in the garden, I came to know that Nicaragua was the most poorly known of all Central American countries botanically. So I got the idea of starting a Flora of Nicaragua, and we hired Doug Stevens and sent him to live in Nicaragua, and he lived there for 11 years and changed gradually by Nicaraguan students, and by building up the whole thing, changed Nicaragua from from the most poorly known country in Central America to probably the best known country botanically, or equal to Costa Rica. I started that. We then kind of started that all over the world. We had begun working when I was at Stanford in Chiapas, and my student Dennis Breedlove lived there, and we had a folk taxonomy program. And again, even in the early 70s, we didn't think of this as so much conservation. We thought of it as cultivated land and forests, and one was one place and one was the other. But my Lord, I mean, the places we worked in Chiapas, I'm sorry, that was in the early 1960s, not the early 1970s. The longer we worked there, the more the forest disappeared, and finally places that we worked were totally deforested. Most of them were totally deforested. Now, for example, the Missouri Botanical Garden has about 125 employees in Madagascar. They're all, which is a high conservation need, and they're all Malagasy. They're all citizens of Madagascar, most of whom we train. So I subscribe personally completely to the idea that Dan Jansen presented about conservation, that if people who are there are not doing it, you might as well forget it, because you can't do it. We recently, Navdat Sodhi, who is a great conservationist at the University of Singapore, suggested that he and I collaborate on a book which is called Voices from the Tropics. And it's 30 essays of people from each from a different tropical country, talking about what was difficult and what was easy, what were their successes and failures in conservation. That's about to come out. And by the way, again, the lessons that they learned exactly parallel what Dan Jansen had to say in his opening lecture at this meeting, that we really do need new paradigms if anything's going to work at all. So by having people in the countries, then the Missouri Botanical Garden began to do more and more and more about conservation and sustainability. And eventually I was able to get endowment for a center to do that. The flora that we started of Costa Rica is proceeding very rapidly and very well. Costa Rica, like all parts of the tropics, was much less well known than we thought it was in the beginning, and so we found a lot more, and it's proceeding. It'll be finished in about 3 or 4 years.
In your exposition, you have raised an interesting issue in that when you do taxonomy, I mean, there's this dichotomy in taxonomy about the moleculars versus the morphology, and that when you do taxonomy, it seems to me that a lot of taxonomies nowadays, they do it from the lab, and they don't necessarily know well their organisms. do you think that that is a trend, or do you think that there are still places like the Missouri Botanical Garden where there is a strong emphasis in,
Well, you never know anything about organisms if you don't go out in the field and look at them, and so I think you've got to look at them. I'm fairly apathetic about barcoding. I'm fairly apathetic. I mean, Ed Wilson, for instance, who's a very close friend of mine, one of the founders of OTS, believes that you ought to catalog all the organisms in the world. But, there are something like 20,000 at the most species of nematodes named, and yet everybody knows there are 2 million or more species of nematodes. If you named them all, you'd have a huge encyclopedia with the names of 2 million nematodes in it, and you'd seen one specimen at Arenal or at Manaus or in Central Park in New York, and you really wouldn't be adding to human knowledge very much. You've got to devise sampling for those poorly known groups. And of course, what I always argued for, and what we argued for in our 1979-80 report on research priorities in tropical biology, was to work on well-known groups like butterflies, like Heliconius as a model, and plants, and mosquitoes, and things that were really well known. Get to know them really broadly geographically, and then for the less well-known groups, do both two things: sample them geographically at intervals and 100 kilometers apart or whatever, and get an idea of the whole picture that way. And my model was, and this hasn't happened so much, our model was as a committee, work on them in great depth at individual stations that were well known otherwise, like Barro, Colorado Island and La Selva and so forth, and really dig into them there, because then you could understand all the relationships between them in a way that you never could if you were just wandering around classifying them. So I think it's great if there's a system that's known in detail, like Dan's system of caterpillars and parasites and all at Guanacaste. I raised some money for acquiring that land too along the way. If there's a system like that, then I think it's great for telling things apart and for digging in more detail. But I think the idea of having 2 million nematodes barcoded so you pop one into your pocket watch or wrist radio, as Dick Tracy had, I just think that's unimportant, because you won't learn anything by doing it, even if you had one dead one on a slide that you got 100 years earlier.
Do you think that taxonomy as a science, it's in peril? Some people have talked about that
No.
there's not enough training of
No,
taxonomists.
I think there are more taxonomists working now by far than there ever have been at any time in the history of the world. Probably more than all of them put together. There's a couple of reasons that we think that it's imperiled. One is that we look back at these great figures who worked for 50 years and accumulated a huge amount of knowledge, and we say, where are they now? Well, they're learning. Secondly, there's more and more of a need for it. There are more and more active people doing it. What has happened is that taxonomy is less popular in universities than it was 30 or 40 years ago, so they have to get training. The training has switched to the museums and so forth, and places like InBio here in Costa Rica. Now the switch of InBio to more and more to public funding here, I think, was a necessary step, but it's very important that Costa Rica find ways to root InBio in the national funding and the national effort and the national consciousness going into the future, because it's a model for countries all over the world. And an organization like that, working in some of the ways I've talked about, concentrating on ecologically, environmentally, and economically important organisms, can make a huge difference, properly supported. But no, I think that people can never get away from going out and looking at organisms in the field, and if they did, what would be the use?
But do you think you mentioned that taxonomy is becoming less popular at university. do you think that we should, somehow try to reverse that?
Some
Or
universities should make a specialty out of it and make a, like a trademark out of it and do it and emphasize it, and some
maybe
do.
partnerships with botanical gardens.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, at Washington, at Missouri Botanical Garden, we'd been partnered with Washington University since 1885, and we've had hundreds of graduates over the years. Of the first 14 PhDs at Washington, of the first 20 PhDs at Washington University, 14 were from the partnership with the garden. So
I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, and
time's running out.
I'm gonna ask you just one more question. What do you think are the conservation challenges now? What do you think should be the priority in terms of?
In a general sense, the conservation challenge now is the growth from 7.1 billion people, 1 billion of them malnourished, projected to 11 billion people by the end of the century. That's unsustainable completely. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has 900 million people now and is projected to have 2.3 billion by the year 2050. Another way, and think of what a catastrophe Africa is now. And then if you look at it another way, there are 3 times as many people in the world as there were when I was born, 3 for every 1. There are 200,000 more people coming to our dinner tables every night. How do we work that? Then how do we work the insatiable desire for consumption of people from all over the world? Then how do we find the new technologies that we need? In other words, conservation is not isolated. It takes place in a global context that involves population, consumption, technology. To do conservation, we've got to solve some pretty major problems. Global Footprint Network, its website footprintnetwork.org, estimates that people of the world are using 1.6 times the world's sustainable productivity right now, which means we're using the total productivity of 1.6 planets, with 1 billion people starving, malnourished, not getting enough, and the desire in individual countries, which have gone way beyond their natural limits, to consume more and more and more and more. It doesn't work. To solve that, we need a steady population. We need socially acceptable levels of consumption all over the world. We need to shake off the illusion of an ever-growing economy, which is an impossibility, and find new ways to develop steady state economies. We need, as part of the journey there, empowering women and children all over the world, because the shameful waste and neglect of women and children all over the world is a disaster for ever achieving sustainability in the world. And all of those things are necessary. Any strategy that we undertake for conservation is undertaken within the umbrella of all of those things and can be seen only in that light. Costa Rica is beyond its biocapacity. Now, where does it go next? I mean, how do all these parks and reserves and Monteverdes and Paloverdes and trees of different kinds, where do they find a place for conservation? The United States is consuming 4 times its fair share per person. Western Europe, more or less the same. Conservation is being held up in those countries as a model, but the world can't afford it. That means that conservation has got to come back to the level of the people all over the world. People have got to embrace conservation. They've got to get something out of conserved areas. They've got to be deeply involved in them. And when that happens, we'll be able to achieve the best results that we can. But the idea of dividing the world into haves and have-nots, into conserved pristine areas and non-conserved pristine areas, is really basically an outrage being conducted in the face of the poor people of the world. and it will never ever succeed. In other words, the questions are much broader than what we do in an individual area, and yet the only thing that will matter ultimately is what we do in individual areas with individual groups of people when they can find a mooring and a sustainable existence in an individual place. The things that we're counting as conservation successes are successes carried out a lot on the backs of the poor. They're not real, and they're not lasting, and they're not sustainable. If we're ever going to get there, and the knowledge that's been imparted to so many thousands of people by OTS will play a major role in helping them to get there in the future as it has in the past, we'll have to simply change our way of thinking morally, spiritually, collectively, and achieve a new paradigm for the future. In doing so, OTS will be a major help, and all of the institutions and people who are involved with it have very important contributions to make.